The conflict in Ukraine intensifies with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Ukraine acknowledged on Friday that it was taking heavy losses in Russia's assault in the east. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's office said Russia was bombarding the front line in the eastern Donetsk region to prevent the Ukrainians from regrouping. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin is threatening, quote, lightning-fast strikes on those he says who want to intervene in the war. We begin our program with the Greek economist and former finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. We spoke earlier about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Yanis Varoufakis, thanks for joining us.
You're most welcome.
The conflict in Ukraine is escalating by the day. We see that on the battlefield. We see that economically. Sanctions are being imposed. Counter-sanctions are being imposed as well. This is a dangerous and risky time, as we hear. Even a small miscalculation, a mistake, could make the situation even worse than it is right now. NATO and Ukraine say they think they can win this war on the battlefield. They will prevail. How do you see this being resolved?
Certainly not in the manner that NATO and then Washington, D.C. are claiming that it will pan out. What does it mean to say that Ukraine is going to win? I'm very pleased that the Ukrainian army has given a bloody nose to Putin's troops. But it's one thing to say that an army of resistance has managed to defend its territory. It's quite another to say that it has won a war against a superpower like Russia. What exactly do the Americans and the Zelenskyy government argue? That they are going to take Moscow? That they will invade the steppes of Russia? How are they going to end this war unless there is an agreement between Washington, D.C. and Moscow? The only alternative would be to take Moscow. Are they mad enough to be contemplating this? I hope they're not, because there are Ukrainian lives at stake. As we speak, people in the Ukraine are dying. They're being maimed. We have the poor of Africa, of Asia, suffering massively as a result of the escalation of food prices. There's a lot of misery being inflicted upon the world. The only sane, rational solution on behalf of Ukrainians is for immediate negotiations between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin to end this madness and to find a way of having a neutral Ukraine on the side of Europe, perhaps with very close links, even membership of the European Union, but not of NATO. That would make sense. It would give Putin a way out, and it would not jeopardize the lives of millions of people.
What do you make of Russia's goals? Russia says that it wants a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that will not join NATO. It wants a Ukraine that will be demilitarized, and then President Putin has talked about denazifying the country as well.
Well, I never make the mistake of identifying a country with its leader. So Russia is a very diverse country. There are colleagues of mine, comrades of mine who are imprisoned in Russia as we speak, suffering from the Putin regime. Vladimir Putin and his people have their own ideas. What seems to me absolutely clear is that we should not want, here in the West, we should not want NATO to expand all the way to the Russian border. Do we really want Russian and NATO nuclear warheads to be stationed within kilometers of one another? That would be complete madness. It would not serve our interests in the West. It would not serve the interests of the Russians. It would certainly not serve the interests of the Ukrainians. So the idea of an Austria-like solution, remember, during the Cold War, Austria was a democratic country, a member of the West. It was a splendid country, a technologically advanced country, a free, liberal country, but it was not in NATO. It was a neutral country. What would be the matter with such a solution for Ukraine? Actually, it would be it wouldn't be a second best even. It would be a first best for Ukraine. It would be a first best for Russia. It would be a first best for NATO and the West. Why are we not discussing this? Instead of talking about hypersonic nuclear weapons, the European Union investing in more and more weaponry, what would they do? Let's say they had it today as we speak. What would they do? Use it against a nuclear power like Russia? Has madness reached such an apotheosis?
What would you say to those who say Ukraine has the sovereign right to do whatever it wants to formulate its own defense and foreign policies and to join whichever alliance it wants to?
Sure, except that half of it is now missing because the Russian army is in it. And the people of Ukraine should make the final decision, but we in the West must help them. Because let's face it, President Zelenskyy, to his credit, has spoken in favor of a neutrality solution a number of times. The only ones who have not spoken about that are the West, and Joe Biden in particular. President Zelenskyy cannot have this negotiation on his own with Putin. His country is under attack, it has been invaded. It is Joe Biden and Washington who are the only ones who have the capacity and the moral duty to sit down with Vladimir Putin, however much they may dislike him, and empower Zelenskyy to get his neutrality solution, the one he has repeatedly said he wants. So let's not hide behind the sovereignty or the theoretical right of Ukraine to be a member of NATO or some galactic empire when the country is under occupation. We in the West need to pave the ground for a solution that will make Ukraine sovereign and give it sovereign rights that are actually current and, implemented as opposed to theoretical.
From the Western or NATO perspective, is this about regime change in Russia? President Biden has said almost that by accident, and more recently we had the Secretary of Defense talking about weakening the Russian military.
I hope not. I hope that Joe Biden is not serious when he talks about regime change, because every time the United States and the West more generally, but the United States in particular, have attempted regime change, it didn't work out very well. Think of Iraq, think of Afghanistan, think of Libya. What happens is 5, 6, 10 years down the road, the Americans and the West depart defeated with their tail between their legs, and what they leave behind is absolute devastation. When I hear people telling me that, oh, come on, why do you say Ukraine cannot win the war? The Mujahideen won in Afghanistan. Yes, the Mujahideen did win in Afghanistan. It took them 10 years. And look at Afghanistan. It is an ungovernable cesspit of misery. Do we want this for Ukraine today? I don't.
One of the weapons being used by both sides in this conflict is that of sanctions. Do you support the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the counter-sanctions that Russia is now introducing?
Look, let me be nuanced about this particular question. If somebody says to me, I do not want to be trading with a power that is invading other countries, I respect that. Do I think it's going to work? Absolutely not. We can see that it hasn't worked. Yes, the sanctions are very harsh and more effective than many of us expected them to be, especially the cutting off of the Central Bank of Russia from the international dollar-based payment system. That was, that was a very bold move by the West, and one that will have repercussions, but let's not get stuck into this. The point I'm making is this. It is going to have a very negative impact on the Russian people, but I don't believe that Vladimir Putin cares about the Russian people that much. It's going to have no effect on him. You can see the value of the ruble has bounced back because Russia, as we speak, as a result of these sanctions, is experiencing the greatest current account surplus in its history, $250 billion, because when they're not importing due to the sanctions and they keep exporting energy, of course they're going to have a surplus. So the regime is not going to be impacted at all.
What do you make of the fact that the majority of the world actually does not support these sanctions that have been imposed against Russia? If we look, not a single country on the African continent, or the Middle East, or Latin America, and then we take the countries with the two biggest populations, China and India, they don't support them.
This is a very interesting phenomenon. We have the decoupling of the North Atlantic West, the global North, as we call it, and the global South. And that's not because the global South is in support of Putin. I think they've had enough of American hypocrisy, of US government hypocrisy. Governments that have perpetrated crimes against humanity in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, before that in Vietnam. They have effected coups in Persia, in Iran, back in the 1950s. In my country, I mentioned the fascist dictatorship here. It was engineered by the CIA. So this mind-numbing hypocrisy, as well as the fear that, well, if they can shut off the Central Bank of Russia, they can shut off any central bank at the drop of a hat for whatever reason. This exorbitant power, which used to be only the power of the dollar, now it is also the power to cut off central banks from the international payment system, is one that spooks the rest of the world, and quite rightly so. If we want a rules-based world management system, we should have one. Not one where the United States decides when it can commit crimes against humanity and when it can call somebody like Putin for his crimes against humanity.
If we look at the impact of this conflict, especially on Europe, we see that many European countries are paying for this. Russia has cut off energy exports to a number of the countries. Most recently, it cut off gas supplies to Bulgaria and to Poland after those countries refused to pay in Russian rubles. Polish and Bulgarian leaders, along with the European Union, accusing Moscow of using natural gas to blackmail countries. I mean, that's despite the fact that these countries are part of the group of countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia. What impact is that having on the bigger picture in Europe? I mean, Europe is paying for this as well.
Europe will come out of this conflict as the continent or the economic bloc, let's put it that way, with the heaviest price that it has paid. Not in terms so much of deaths. Yes, the Ukrainians are suffering very badly, but I see the European Union as a whole emerging out of this conflict as more divided and fragmented, poorer, much, much poorer, and far more reactionary. Remember, once upon a time, we had hopes of a proper European Union where, we would have a common defense policy, a common foreign policy. None of this is happening. All we have is European governments are being beaten into submission by Washington, D.C. They are forced to follow the lead of Washington when it comes to armaments, when it comes to expanding NATO. There is no European Union defense. You put together the words European defense and policy, and you end up with a joke. And if you combine that with the fragmentation of our economies and the serious impact on the capacity of the European Union to reproduce its economic model, I believe that the European continent is going to come out very wounded out of this conflict.
So is it perhaps time for Europe to formulate its own foreign policy goals independent of Washington?
It would be great, wouldn't it? Remember what Mahatma Gandhi said once when he was asked what he thought about British civilization. He said it would be a great idea. I have the same response when people ask me what do I think about the European Union. It would be a great idea to have one, but we don't. Back in 2010, I got involved in the Greek debt crisis for many reasons, one of them being that the inability of the European Union to deal with the fact that we didn't have a common bond, something like the US Treasury bills, or like the Chinese government's bonds, that the fact that we were refusing to bind together our debts, we were refusing to come up with a proper European Parliament. We don't have a European Parliament. We have only in name European Parliament. Let me give you a very simple example. The European Union decided to spend 1.5 billion euros to buy armaments on behalf of Ukraine. Now, this is an important fund and a very serious decision to make. It is not being overseen by any parliament, not even the European Parliament. So you see, the European Union, instead of getting closer together, we're being more fragmented, poorer, and in the end more reactionary as a result of this. I wish that were not the case, and a European Union, not just in name, but in actuality, were to come out of this war, but it won't. It doesn't seem to be moving in that direction, I fear.
Yanis Varoufakis, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist for the independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. Peter Zalmayev is director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and foreign policy research director at the Brookings Institution right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Michael O'Hanlon, we just heard some very strong opinions there from the former Greek finance minister, but I want to get to one of the specific things he talked about at the beginning of that interview, and that was the way out of this. He said the only way out of this is through negotiations, is through a diplomatic solution. And he pointed to the fact that President Zelenskyy of Ukraine is open to having his country being neutral, not seeking membership of NATO. So I'm wondering, why don't we see more vigorous efforts being made by the United States and its NATO allies to get to the negotiating table?
Greetings. Well, let me first say that I enjoyed that interview, and I thought it was smart and provocative and in a useful way. And I agreed with many of his points, especially about the idea of NATO expansion to Ukraine being perhaps an unfortunate idea. I thought he went too far at the end, myself, in condemning the notion that Europe was going to come out of this stronger. I think Europe's been incredibly impressive at pushing back against the Russian invasion and aggression. But still, I think his broader historical perspective on what led to this crisis, with even some blame to go around in the West, was useful and well stated. In terms, though, of sort of how we can move forward and the idea of negotiations, I think he's basically right. However, what he didn't really hone in on enough is the question of territory. Vladimir Putin, I don't believe, will actually be content just to have Ukraine promise neutrality, and then Putin will somehow pull his armies back from all the parts of Ukraine that it currently occupies, whether it's the Crimea, the Donbass, Mariupol, or points in between. I think Russia is going to want a chunk of land out of this, and that's too bad. That's tragic, and that makes the negotiations very difficult. If you're President Zelenskyy and you've just seen 20,000 of your own people killed trying to withstand a Russian assault on Mariupol, how do you then relinquish Mariupol as if it's somehow a fair part of a reasonable deal among gentlemen? So this is going to be awfully tough. And I think we in the West, in China, elsewhere, need to be a little bit sensitive to the fact that Ukraine is probably going to be asked by Russia to give up chunks of its territory after having been the victim of aggression. That's going to be the big, difficult challenge. And I also think, last point, that when we are seeing this incipient fight in the East, and no one's quite sure how it's going to go, because it's going to be a little different than the fight for Kyiv. It's different terrain, different time of year, different preparation on the battlefield. And I think both sides are going to want to test their own mettle and see if they can do relatively well. Ukraine's going to hope to maintain its military momentum. Russia's going to hope that it can do better in the open terrain of the East in a more conducive time of year. And until they've settled a little bit of that dynamic and figured out who's stronger militarily, I doubt very much you could have a successful negotiation, because the negotiations ultimately are not just about whether Ukraine's neutral, which I think I would agree and support, and so would others, but which pieces of territory are somehow relinquished to Russia. And that's going to be a tough call, and one where I think Putin's ambitions right now are probably greater than your previous interviewee acknowledged.
So, Michael, that makes it very difficult for President Zelenskyy, and that's putting it very mildly. I mean, the choice that he is facing right now, as he watches his country being destroyed, as he watches his countrymen dying every single day, the choice is that he has to agree to give away large parts of Ukraine in return for peace.
That's what I'm afraid of. It would be very nice if there could be some other solution, if there could be maybe parts of Ukraine that were somehow joint sovereignty, including Crimea, or UN administered, and then some kind of international arbitration in 15 years. And then Russia actually gets nothing specific right now out of the aggression. Because let's face it, Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia has killed tens of thousands of people. And I feel bad for Russians because they've lost maybe 20,000 killed in action. I feel bad for the Russian troops, the Russian families who have lost their sons and daughters, especially their sons, in this terrible war. And so after that kind of carnage, how do you expect either side, realistically, to make this kind of a brave peace where there are compromises not only on Ukraine's future geostrategic status, which I think is the easy part, but on territory?
Michael, one other point, very briefly, before I move on to the other guests, and that is President Putin has responded to what he calls Western threats with a threat of his own, saying that Russia is prepared to deliver what he called lightning-fast strikes. I mean, this is a very dangerous period, and I'm wondering, what is your assessment of how dangerous it is and how risky the situation is right now?
It's moderately dangerous. I would never want to trivialize the danger. And when you see superpowers with nuclear weapons exchanging threats, or Russia threatening us and our weapons helping Russia's enemy, it's a fraught moment, and no one should trivialize that. I don't think Vladimir Putin's suicidal. I don't think he's going to start fighting NATO over the current dynamic.
Yep.
And I think he'll try to secure that land in the south and southeast and east without any kind of further intervention. But if he ever feels backed into a corner, then I wouldn't put it past him to try some kind of at least a symbolic nuclear escalation or something like that.
Pavel Felgenhauer, Russia has bombed targets in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. That only happened over the past day. It actually happened during a visit by the United Nations Secretary General, who was in Ukraine at the time, trying to broker some kind of humanitarian ceasefire. You know, listening to what the other guests have said, Pavel, what do you believe is the Russian goal here? Is it just neutrality, a demilitarized Ukraine, denazification, as President Putin has said, or is it something more?
Well, as officially said and repeated many times by the Kremlin and by President Putin himself, all the objectives of the operation will be surely met. In due time, the plan is going it's all going as planned, and basically victory is going to be ours. That's the message coming from Russia. We're fighting till victory, and that the Russian people should rest assured that victory is going to be achieved. So as it should be, I mean, a wartime leader is saying that the fight is still victory, and that negotiations with Ukraine are not working, negotiations are stalled. That means we should achieve victory. And that's more or less what's being right now happening. The fight is beginning to heat up. Right. As a summer campaign time is coming up. It's not yet totally there, but it is. That's so more or less it's and today the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy said that maybe Ukraine will break off negotiations because they're senseless with Russia. And he says that only a summit between him and Putin can bring any kind of solution. Right. But that's again right now not on the cards. So I believe it's going to be not talk, it's going to be war.
Peter Zalmayev, great to have you with us on the show. Welcome to the show. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what you've been hearing about how this brutal conflict comes to an end. Ukraine and Ukrainians are paying a very high price for this. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their country. There are parts of the country which are in complete ruins right now. Where does it go to from the Ukrainian point of view from here?
Well, it is also, I mean, it has nowhere to go but towards victory, you know, in a paradoxical way. You know, Ukraine is going through some tough times, very challenging times. That would be an understatement to say that. Its infrastructure is being pummeled. You know, over 5 million of Ukrainians have had to leave the country. It's a safe bet to make that a lot of them probably will not return, and those are the best and the brightest, obviously. On the other hand, what we are seeing right now is a forging of a steely new mentality, new identity for Ukrainians. I am a Ukrainian myself from a Russian-speaking part, from Donetsk originally. I'm a Ukrainian American, and I have never felt as proud and as clearly identifiable to myself as a Ukrainian, whether I still speak Russian at home or if I speak English or I speak Ukrainian, which I have actually learned in the past 2 years myself for the first time. So in a way, like I said, it's a paradox that Ukrainians are feeling as proud as ever about their country, their identity, and the fact that they're not Russian. You see, Vladimir Putin has said that the West is guilty for creating an anti-Russia by Russia's side, which is Ukraine. Well, I would say this. Putin is mad at Ukraine for not being anti-Russia, but for being un-Russia, for not being part of Russia. Vladimir Putin has denied Ukrainians the right to exist. And so this has been a colonial war, I would agree with Michael, of colonial conquest. So the NATO expansion issue is a red herring. What Mr. Varoufakis has offered before, a month ago, I listened to his previous interviews, some kind of a compromise. NATO, no to NATO expansion. Folks, that ship has sailed already. You have, as a result of Vladimir Putin's ridiculous and stupid policy, stupid decision to attack Ukraine, Finland and Sweden are now becoming part of NATO, and everyone in the neighborhood is going to want to be a part of NATO or some other military alliance to secure against this very irrational seeming actor that is Vladimir Putin.
Michael, one of the points that Yanis Varoufakis made during that interview was he said that Europe has come off worse in this crisis. And I know you did address that, but one of the questions I asked him towards the end there, is it time for Europe to formulate and adopt and implement its own defense and foreign policies independent of the United States? I mean, if you look at the transatlantic alliance, it's been the bedrock of the post-World War II international security architecture. What do you make of that? Will Europe and the United States go their own ways?
No. I think this crisis shows how close they really are when push comes to shove, although there is the big wild card of whether Donald Trump could be president again or someone like him. And that could be the one thing that could create a big enough fissure as to question the basic cooperation. But what we're seeing in this crisis is that, in fact, the European Union is the more important player economically, although certainly the sanctioning of the Russian central bank and the role in the dollar-based economy is crucial. So the U.S. has played a very important secondary role, but Europe's willingness to disentangle from Russia economically, I think, is the most important single economic warfare instrument we've had in this crisis. And American military power is an essential element for protecting the east of NATO and the EU. If we wanted to be able to see the Europeans protect their own territory with the forces of Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Poland, etc., then EU and NATO enlargement should have stopped no further east than Poland. Once you go to the Baltic states, you need the United States because the Europeans can't project enough power far enough and northerly enough locations to maintain that commitment on their own. So Europe needs the United States for military reasons. The United States needs Europe for the economic campaign against Russia. And together, Europe and the United States and Canada, we account for more than half of world military spending and 45% of world GDP. So it's still, for all of its flaws and challenges, the most remarkable community of nations really in the history of the planet. And it's showing it couldn't prevent this war, but it's certainly going to protect itself pretty well, I think. And it's certainly going to punish the heck out of Russia for what it's done.
And I'm afraid that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.